Hello, my junior says, welcome to another physiology lecture series. It's your great science tutor Lorenzo, and today we'll be talking about the cardiac cycle. In my last video, I talked about the introduction to cardiophysiology, and we have talked about the cardiovascular system already. We have introduced the cardiovascular system, and immediately we introduced the cardiovascular system. We talked about so many things in the cardiovascular system. We talked about the heart, we talked about the blood vessel, we talked about the circulation, we talked about so many stuff, even how blood is generated and pumped out to the tissues. That's what we did in the last class. So now we'll be going into cardiac cycle. What are the phases that occurs in the heart, and how does the heart pumps blood? What are the amount of blood the heart pumps, and what are the mechanism to which all this thing occurs? When we hear a beat, remember I told you that there's three heart sounds, but two that is physiologically right, which is the first and second heart sound, which is the lump and the dub. So wait till the end of this video. You will see the phases that occurs between each heartbeat. So each beat we get, each heart sound we get, the phases that occurs between them is what we call the cardiac cycle. So at the end of the video, I'll assess you all and I'll give you useful mnemonics that you use for your exams. So if you are new to my channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on your post notification button, so that anytime I drop any video, you'll be sure to be notified. If you want me to make a video for you, make sure you drop it down in the comment section. I promise I'll make that video for you. Let us jump right into the video. So introducing the cardiac cycle now. What do we know about the cardiac cycle? Remember, cardiac, which means heart. Cardiac, which means heart. Cycle, which means a successive event, or is an event that moves in a cycle. So what is cardiac cycle? A cardiac cycle is a sequence of successive events that occurs between each beat. It is a sequence of successive events that occurs between each beat. So each beat is produced during what? The first heart sound, when the AV valve closes. The second heart sound, when the semilunar valve closes. The AV valve is the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, while the semilunar valve is the aortic and the pulmonary valve. So when the first one closes, you get the first heart sound. When the second one closes, you have the second heart sound. So the sequence of events that occurs between each beat, because between each beat there is what we call contraction and relaxation. Contraction and relaxation between each beat. So one will contract, one will relax. The atrium and the ventricle cannot contract and relax at the same time. One will relax while one will contract. So now we have two main events. We have the atrial event and we have the ventricular event. Remember, I told you between each beat we have contraction and relaxation. And anytime we have contraction, we call that a systole. And anytime we have a relaxation, we have diastole. So when the heart contracts, we call it systole, and when the heart relaxes, we call it diastole. I told you, when the SVC and IVC put blood into the right atrium, when the SVC and IVC they empty their content into the right atrium, what will the atrium do? The atrium will relax to receive the blood. That is called atrial diastole, which means the atrium is at rest. Now when the blood goes to the ventricle, now what happens? The ventricle pumps out the blood to the rest of the body or to the lungs. That is what we call ventricular systole. So when the heart is contracting, or any of the chambers is contracting, which means the chamber is said to be in systole. But when any of the chamber is relaxing to receive the blood, we say that the chamber is on diastole. So systole, heart contracting; diastole, heart relaxing or resting. You get it now? So the series of successive events between systole and diastole is what we call the cardiac cycle. So for the cardiac cycle to occur, the heart must relax at some point and the heart must contract at some point. So again, I said, what is systole? Systole is the phase of contraction of the heart, during which the heart pumps out blood. The heart ejects blood from the ventricle to the aorta and the pulmonary. So not only the aorta and the pulmonary, the atrium also contracts sometimes too, but the contraction of the atrium is so minimal. Now the phases of contraction, especially of the heart, which part of the heart? The ventricle, for it to pump out blood to the aorta, to the rest of the body, or to the pulmonary, to the lungs, is called systole. Are you getting now? So in ventricular systole, it just takes at least 0.3 seconds. In atrial systole, it just takes 0.1 seconds. So atrial systole coincides with what we call ventricular diastole. We'll be talking about it later. You get it now? So diastole is when the heart is at rest, when it is feeling blood, when blood is entering it. So the heart is at atrial diastole. And what is the heart rate? The number of heartbeat per minute is called heart rate. The number of heartbeat per minute, and is about 60 to 100 beats per minute. 60 to 100 beats per minute. Don't forget, for the heart to be contracting, systole. For the heart to relax, diastole. And the normal heart rate, are you getting me now, is the heartbeat per minute, which is 60 to 100 beats per minute. Are you getting me now? So next is that we have the component of the cardiac cycle. We have the component of the cardiac cycle. So in the component of this cardiac cycle, we have the atrial event and we have the ventricular event. Are you getting me now? The atrial event and the ventricular event. The atrial event is when the atria is in diastole and the atria is in systole. The ventricular event is the when the ventricle is in diastole and the ventricle is in systole. So you get it now. So now in the atria being in diastole, what happens? The two atrium is relaxing, receiving blood. Both of them is relaxing, receiving blood. So when the right atrium relaxes, what happens? It receives blood from the rest of the body through the SVC and the IVC, which we call the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. That is when the atrium is in diastole, which means the atrium is resting. So if you receive blood into the right atrium, which means receiving blood from the SVC and IVC, from the head and neck, from the rest of the body. So if blood is coming to the left atrium, which means it's coming from the lungs to the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins brings oxygenated blood from the lungs into the left atrium through the pulmonary veins, while the SVC and IVC bring blood into the right atrium. Are you getting now? All this in the atria is on diastole, relaxing to receive blood, and it takes about 0.7 seconds for all these things to occur. Are you getting that? Because the heart has to receive enough amount of blood before it gets to go oxygenate them. Now in atrial systole is when the atrium is contracting minimally to push blood into the ventricle. In atrial systole, the atria has to contract minimally to push blood into the ventricle. Are you getting me now? But atrial systole, because if the atrium contracts, or if the blood gets filled into the atrium do not have to contract strongly, because gravity will help the atrium push blood into the ventricle. Again, now so at this particular point, the AV valve will open, which is a bicuspid and tricuspid valve. Now the blood is already in the atrium. The AV valve will open for the blood to be pushed into the ventricle. But now it doesn't need enough force, it just needs minimal force. You get it? I just need minimal force. So the last contraction that the atrium will contract in order to push blood is called the atrial kick, and it's corresponding with what we call the ventricular diastole. You get it? Now so atrial systole is that additional force needed for the atrium to push blood into the ventricle. So it's not that contraction like the ventricular contraction, because the ventricle has to contract strongly to push blood because it's pushing blood against gravity. But the atrium pushing blood into the ventricle, gravity is already supporting it, so the contraction will not be much. So that is number one. So we have talked about atrial diastole and we have talked about atrial systole. Now atrial diastole takes 0.7 seconds, atrial systole takes what, 0.1 seconds. Okay, now so now the next one here is what, ventricular diastole. What happens in ventricular diastole? In ventricular diastole, what happens? The ventricle is relaxing to do what? To receive blood. The ventricular diastole, the ventricle is relaxing to receive what? Blood. Yeah, now, and when the ventricle is relaxing to receive blood, this is at this particular point what happens here, because we'll still talk about it very well. The ventricle is relaxing, it gets relaxed, the atrium with the help of gravity push blood, because the AV valve has to open at this particular point, and when the AV valve opens, the atrium, the blood in the atrium, the total amount of blood collected will be pushed down into the ventricle. And when it gets to push down into the ventricle, what happens? The AV valve is the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve. They have to open in order for the atrium to push blood into the ventricle. You get it now? So immediately this thing is occurring as the atrium is pushing blood into the ventricle, the semilunar valve has to close. Now when all the blood is collected in the ventricle, what happens? The ventricle now contracts strongly and push blood up, because the aorta is like vertically placed, while the pulmonary trunk is vertically placed. So the two ventricles, the right and left ventricle, has to contract strongly to push that blood upwards, and by doing this, the semilunar valve will open. The semilunar valve will open while the AV valve will close. Why? Because we don't want the blood that have entered into the ventricle to be regurgitated back to the atrium. We want them to stay in the ventricle so that it will be pumped out to the lungs or for systemic circulation. Okay, now, so remember I said we have two types of circulation. We have systemic circulation and we have what? Pulmonary circulation. From the right ventricle you go for pulmonary circulation, from the left ventricle you go to systemic circulation. Okay, now, so we'll talk about all of them in no time. And for this event, the atrial event must be 0.8 seconds, the ventricular event has to be 0.8 seconds. So one cardiac cycle lasts for 0.8 seconds at rest, and most of the time is spent in the ventricular diastole. So ventricular diastole is much more longer, not even longer. Atrial diastole is much more long because the heart has to get filled first before it is pumped out. I get it. But the most important part is the ventricle receiving blood. Because if the ventricle do not receive enough amount of blood, what happens? It will not be supplied to circulation, it will not be supplied to the body, or it will not be supplied to the lungs. So the ventricle needs blood more, and that is the most important phase here. Coordinated arterial and ventricular event ensure what? Efficient pumping of blood. So as far as the arterial event is occurring and the ventricular event is occurring, there will be efficiency in blood pumping. Now don't forget, atrial diastole, the atria is at rest receiving blood, and this occurs for 0.87 seconds. Sorry, the hair is 0.7 seconds, not 0.4 seconds. It occurs for 0.7 seconds. Atrial systole is 0.1 seconds because this one, it doesn't need to contract strongly. Gravity helps it to push the blood. Ventricular diastole, 0.5 seconds because the ventricle is receiving blood from the atrium while the AV valve is open. You get it now? So it's very, very simple. It's very, very important for you to know. So to talk about what I've said before again, now listen, we have the atrial event. Now listen to the atrial event. In the atrial event again, if we are to say it very well now, the atrial event, the atrium is at rest. Are you getting now? In atrial diastole, the atria is at rest, and if the atria is at rest, what happens? Blood will be filled from the SVC and IVC, which is coming from the head to the SVC, and we coming from the other part of the body to the IVC into the right atrium. And when they end down to the right atrium, what happens? The atria has to relax. The atria has to relax in order to receive the blood. And as the atria is relaxing, the AV valves are closed, because you don't want, as you are filling into the right atrium or the left atrium, the blood should be entering the ventricle immediately. No, because the atria is at rest, but the ventricle is what? Contracting. So the atria is at rest, which is the atria is on diastole, but the ventricle is on what? Systole at this particular point. So both of them are not working together. So you see now, blood is coming from the SVC and IVC into the right atrium, and blood is coming from the pulmonary vein into the what? Left atrium. Are you getting now? So them, they are relaxing while the ventricle is what? Contracting at that same point. You get it now? So now always remember, it is what? 0.7 seconds, and it corresponds with the first heart sound. How does it correspond with the first heart sound? Because during this particular point, the AV valves are closed, and anytime the AV valve is closed, there's always the first heart sound. Are you getting now? There's always the first heart sound. But now in atrial systole, what happens? The atrium is contracting, and only 10% of the blood enters into the ventricle. The atria is contracting, but the atria is contracting minimally because gravity is helping the atrium push blood into the ventricle. And as atrium is pushing blood into the ventricle, the AV valves are open. The AV valves are open in this case, and the semilunar valves are closed. What are the semilunar valves? The aortic and the pulmonary valve. They are closed at this particular point. So since they are closed at this particular point, the atrium do not have to contract, but the atrium, now when the gravity have helped the atrium push blood into the ventricle, the last stroke that takes the atrium to push blood into the ventricle is called the atrial kick. The last stroke, or the additional blood it takes the atrium to push the blood into the ventricle, is where atrial systole works very well, which is the atrial kick. So atrial systole is not really a phase. It only combines with what we call the ventricular diastole, the last rapid filling of the ventricular diastolic phase. So the last rapid filling. So it doesn't work immediately. No, it doesn't work immediately. It just coincides with the last phase of the ventricular diastole. Are you getting me now? So we have talked about atrial diastole, and we have talked about atrial systole. 0.7 seconds for atrial diastole, 0.1 seconds for atrial systole, because atrial systole doesn't really just occur Are you getting me now? Gravity just help blood to push its content into the ventricle without stressing. So but if there's a small amount of blood inside the atrium, and when gravity does that thing, the atrium has to now contract forcefully to push that blood into the ventricle, and it only takes 0.1 seconds. I hope you understand. The atrium relaxes and feeds blood into through the veins. Are you getting me now? So your SVC, IVC, and pulmonary veins. And atrial systole is a small contraction that puts blood into the ventricle. Now in the ventricular phase, what happens here? In the ventricular phase, what happens? Now we have ventricular diastole. In ventricular diastole, remember, diastole is the filling phase. In ventricular diastole, it is a filling phase. So what happens? The ventricle relaxes, and when the ventricle relaxes, the AV valve opens, ventricle relaxes, AV valve opens, and when the AV valve opens, what happens? Blood comes from the atrium into the ventricle by gravity. Blood comes from the atrium into the ventricle by gravity. But in doing this, the AV valve now has to open, because for blood to be pumped from the atrium to the ventricle, look at the arrow, for blood to come from the atrium into the ventricle, the AV valve has to open. But as the AV valve is opening, who has to close? The other valves, which is the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are the output valves where blood leaves to the lungs and to the rest of the body. They have to be closed while the AV valve open. You get it now? So that is how it is. Are you getting now? That is how it is. So one thing you have to understand, as the blood is moving from the atrium into the ventricle, very simple. At this particular point, what happens now? As the blood enters into the ventricle, we have three phases of it. You have what? First, rapid filling. We have what we call first rapid filling. In this first rapid filling, what happens? The blood rushes into the ventricle. First rapid filling, 70% of the blood rushes into the ventricle. 70% of the blood rushes into the ventricle. Now in slow filling, only we just have 20% of the blood rushing into the ventricle. Why sometimes we could say 10% of the blood is rushing into the ventricle in slow filling. So we have first rapid filling, we have slow filling. Are you getting me now? In slow filling, only 10% of the blood enters into the ventricle. So the first rapid filling, 70%, where the blood rush on. Slow filling, 10%. And the last one, last rapid filling. And last rapid filling, what happens? The blood, the atrium contracts to push the last amount of blood into the ventricle. And that takes only to 20%. Only 20% of the blood enters. Only 20% of the blood enters. Don't forget. So we have the first rapid filling, we have the slow filling, and we have the last rapid filling. All this one occurs in ventricular diastole. And the total amount of blood the ventricle receives is 150 ml, which is the end diastolic volume. So the total amount of blood that enters from the atrium into the ventricle is 150 ml, called the end diastolic volume. So if it's less than 150 ml, it's a problem. So 150 ml must enter into the ventricle using the first rapid filling, the slow filling, and the last rapid filling. Now when this one have occurred, now all the blood is 150 ml, the end diastolic volume is already in the ventricle. Immediately the AV valve will close. If the AV valve closes, we are still getting the first heart sound. I get it now. Remember, when we are filling into the ventricle, the AV valve is open, the semilunar valve is closed. We get the second heart sound. That is DUP, D-U-B, D-U-B, DUP. But when the AV valve now closes, we get the first heart sound. So closure of the AV valve when the atrium is filling gives us the first heart sound. Closure of the semilunar valve when the ventricle is filling gives us the second heart sound. So now the AV valve has closes because blood is now in the ventricle trying to push itself out. The semilunar valve will open. So when the semilunar valve, all the blood that is collected inside the ventricle now will do what? Will be ejected out from the heart. I will be ejected out from the heart, and for them to be ejected out from the heart, what happens? The AV valve has to what? The AV valve has to close so that there will be regurgitation of blood. Blood will not go back to the atrium. The blood is already in the ventricle, 150 ml. We don't want the blood to go back into the atrium. We want it to stay in the ventricle so that it will be ejected out from the heart. So the AV valve has to close, and the semilunar valve will open. And if the semilunar valve opens now, it's good. The semilunar valve has to open so that the blood will be pumped out through the aorta to the rest of the body and through the pulmonary trunk to the lungs. Okay, now so blood will be ejected out from the lungs, and this takes about 0.3 seconds. Are you getting now? 0.3 seconds. So very, very simple, very, very nice. Hope you're understanding it. So the ventricle has to contract strongly, pushing out blood. When the ventricle contract to push out blood, we call that what we call the ejection fraction. Only 60 to 67% of blood is pumped out. Only 60 to 67% of blood is pumped out during this ejection period. Only 60 to 67% of blood is pumped out, relieving only 35% or less. You leaving like 40 or 35 to 40% of blood remaining, and what you call the end systolic volume. So 150 ml entered, only 60 to 67% of that blood is pumped out, leaving 35 to 40%, called the end systolic volume. So the end systolic volume is the amount of blood remaining from the heart when you pump out the blood, while the end diastolic volume is the volume of blood that enters into the ventricle during atrial systole or during ventricular diastole. Because atrial systole coincides with ventricular diastole, and atrial diastole coincides with ventricular systole. You get it now? So in this phase now we have isovolumetric contraction. In isovolumetric contraction, what happened? The AV valve is closed, like I said, the semilunar valve is open, and blood is pumped out. And the rate at which the blood is pumped out is called the ejection phase. Ejection phase is when the blood is pumped out, and the fraction of blood that is pumped out is called the ejection fraction, which should be between 60 to 67%. I get him now. So total phase takes 0.3 seconds. While the atrial systole occurs in 0.1 seconds, the atrial diastole occurs in 0.7 seconds. So both of them equals 0.8 seconds. While the ventricular diastole occurs in 0.5 seconds approximately, while the ventricular systole occurs in 0.3 seconds. But some textbook we say the atrial diastole occurs in 0.3 seconds, while the ventricular systole occurs in 0.5 seconds. So don't forget. So you get the first heart sound when the AV valve closes, when the blood is already in the ventricle and ventricular systole is occurring, and you get the second heart sound when, you don't forget, you get the first heart sound when the blood is in the ventricle getting to pump out to the semilunar valve, and the atrium is already getting filled with blood. So when the atrium is getting filled with blood, the atrium will be relaxing, the AV valve will close so that the blood will not leak into the ventricle. But when the second heart sound will come is when blood is filling from the atrium into the ventricle. So atrial filling, first heart sound. Atrial filling, first heart sound. Ventricular filling, second heart sound. Atrial filling, first heart sound because the AV valves are closed. Ventricular filling, second heart sound because the semilunar valves are closed. You get it now? That's what I've said. Are you getting now? Don't forget. Don't forget. Don't forget. You get it now? Now, ventricular diastole is longer than its systole. Always remember. But sometimes we could say ventricular systole is longer than its diastole, but the filling phase of the ventricle is much more longer. Are you getting now? But some textbook we say no, it is 0.3 seconds. And most ventricular filling occurs during diastole. We know that. And ventricular systole is a period. I get when blood is ejected from the heart, and we get the first and second heart sound to lop and dop. So I give you this calculation also. So sometimes it might be equal or not be equal with that of your textbooks and all this thing, because everybody has different methods of explaining his or her own. So we have the ventricular diastole and the ventricular systole. Are you getting now? Equal. So I've explained it already. So we have the pressure changes during cardiac cycle. What are the pressure changes during cardiac cycle? What are the pressure changes during cardiac cycle? So this is it here. Very, very simple. I get it now. The first pressure changes is different here now. You see, at about between 80 to 100, what happens as the aortic during the atrial diastole, what happens? The pressure is lesser. Are you getting me now? The pressure is lesser at that particular point because the atrium is just receiving blood. But now when the aortic valve opens during atrial systole, what happens? During atrial systole, when the atrium is pumping out blood, the pressure rises a little to about 100. Do you understand now? The pressure is lesser in atrial diastole. Pressure is lesser in atrial diastole because the atrium do not have to, the pressure is very low because the atrium do not have to contract at that particular point. It is relaxing. The atria is relaxing, but the AV valves are closed. Atria is relaxing, but the AV valves are closed. So since the AV valves are closed, what happens? The atrium is not relaxing, the pressure is low. But now when the atrium is about to contract, the pressure goes high to about 100. Are you getting now? So now during ventricular systole, what happens? The pressure increases 100%. It increases 100%. At least you know the pressure, which is 120 mmHg. So that 120 mmHg, which is the ventricular systolic pressure, the pressure has to go up to about 120 mmHg in order to push the blood away. In order to push the blood away. Again, now, in order to push the blood away. When you push the blood away, now during ventricular diastole, now the pressure comes down again. The pressure comes down because during ventricular diastole, the ventricle is relaxing, so the pressure is low. During atrial systole, the atrial pressure is low. During ventricular diastole, the ventricular pressure is low. But during the systole and diastole of the aortic systole and ventricular systole, the pressure is what? High. But in aortic systole, what happened? The pressure goes to 100, and aortic and ventricular systole, the pressure goes to about 120. So you can see the pressure difference up there. You can see the pressure difference up there. So checking it also is very, very simple. So the same thing here for those with the aortic atrial pressure, because we have done the see the atrial pressure against the ventricular pressure. You see it now. So the aortic pressure is very low because the atrium is the pressure in the atrium is very, very low, because the atrium is not a site which pump blood to the body, which means it's just feeding the ventricle blood. The pressure in the ventricle, the pressure needed the atrium. The atrial pressure is low because it's just feeding blood into the ventricle, so it doesn't need a lot of what pressure. So the atrial pressure during atrial diastole, the pressure is between 0 to 20. I get it, because it is the blue line. Atrial pressure is the blue line, ventricular pressure is the green line. So the atrial pressure in the blue line, at first it is between 0 to 20, up to a 20. Then during atrial systole, it pumps out to about a 20. It pumps out to about a 20. Are you getting me now? Let's say it is at 18 mark at that particular point. It was at the 18 mark during atrial diastole. It now pumps up to what? 20 during atrial systole, and it now tanks during ventricular systole, because during ventricular systole the atrium is not working. The atrial pressure is low at that particular point in time. Then during ventricular diastole, the aortic pressure have to increase. Why? Because it is contracting to release blood. You get it now? So because I said atrial systole equals to ventricular diastole, and atrial diastole equals to ventricular systole. You get it now? You get it now? So at atrial diastole, the aortic pressure, the atrial pressure is between 0.2 seconds. During atrial systole, the pressure is between 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. During ventricular diastole, what happens? The atrial pressure descends between 0.3 to about 0.6 seconds. And now during ventricular diastole, it increases high, because at that particular point blood is pushing into the ventricle. Now look at the pumping of the ventricular pressure. The ventricular pressure at least is between 0 to 20 mmHg during atrial diastole. Are you getting me now? During atrial diastole, when the atria is relaxing to collect blood, immediately during atrial systole, what happens? As blood is pumping, it skyrockets high, which coincides with ventricular systole. The pressure is high because the ventricle and the atrium takes more blood. They need more blood to be pumped into into circulation and the lungs. So what now? The pressure has to increase to about 120 mmHg. Are you getting me now? But during ventricular diastole, the ventricular pressure also decreases. So you can see there. Now talking about the volume changes in the ventricle. I get them now. The volume changes in the ventricle. Now you can see it now that we have the end diastolic blood pressure. You can see it now, end diastolic blood pressure, because during atrial diastole now what happens? It is, let me say, it's at 130 mark. At atrial diastole, because the ventricle at that particular point is not receiving blood at that particular point. During atrial systole, what happens? It pumps up to about 140 at 140 mark. So that is approximately 140 mark. Then during ventricular systole, because all the blood is pumped out, so during ventricular systole, the end systolic blood volume decreases. Are you getting me now? You see the end systolic blood volume decreases, so it goes down. That depression goes down. Are you getting me now? At that particular point, because in systole, what happened? All the blood is pumped out from the ventricle. While in ventricular diastole, during filling, it goes back to about 130, 150 mark. 130, between that range is about 130 to 150 mark. Are you getting me now? It's about 130 to 150 mark. So that is it. Don't forget, it's very, very important for you to know it. So it's showing you that the end systolic blood volume, because it's the amount of blood that is remaining in the ventricle during that phase, while end diastolic blood volume is the total amount of blood. Is, I said 150 ml, but in some textbooks they can say 120 to 130 ml. Are you getting that? So 120 to 130 mil, some textbook 150 mil. I'm trying to quote from different part of your texts so that you understand. So what is the timing now? Are you getting now? What is the timing of the heart sound? I told you that it's 0.8 seconds before you get each heart sound. So when the AV valve closes, you get the first heart sound. The AV valve closes, you get the first heart sound. I told you that the AV valve closes during atrial diastole because the atria is being filled with blood. The atria is being filled with blood during atrial diastole, you get the first heart sound. Are you getting now? So now when the ventricle is being filled with blood too, when the ventricle is being filled with blood during ventricular diastole, you get the second heart sound because the semilunar valves are closed at this particular point and the AV valves are open. So the first heart sound you get a lob sound, and the second heart sound you get a dub sound. The difference between them is about 0.8 seconds between systole and diastole, the atrial event and the ventricular event. So I told you that the end diastolic volume is between 120 to 130, but in some textbook 150. And systolic volume is between 70 to 80, while in here it is 50 to 60 ml. Now the stroke volume is the difference between the end diastolic volume and end systolic volume, which is 70 ml. And now what is the ejection fraction? The ejection fraction is the stroke volume over the end diastolic volume times 100 over 1, which should be between 55 to 65%, while some textbook will say 60 to 67%. 60 to 67%. So now for example, now if we have the end diastolic volume to be 125 and the end systolic volume to be 55, the stroke volume will be 125 minus 55 equals to 70 ml. Then the ejection fraction of the heart will be 70 over 125 times 100 over 1. That is 56, which is normal in some people, not everybody. But a good heart should have an ejection fraction about 60 to 65%. So let us go over what we have said before. Let's go over what we have said before. We have the atrial diastole. The atria is being filled with blood, and the atria is being filled with blood through the SVC and the IVC into the right atrium and through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. We call it the veins. So when they are being filled with blood, what happens? It takes about 0.7 seconds. And who is closed? The AV valve. The AV valves are what? Closed, while the semilunar valves are what? Open. Are you getting me now? You get it now? The AV valves are closed, while the semilunar valves are what? Open. You get it now? So here there's a mistake here. The AV valves are closed, the semilunar valves are open. So correct this one while you're writing it. And it takes 0.7 what? Seconds. And the pressure in the atrium is very low because it's receiving what? Blood. But as the pressure is low, the volume is increases. So the pressure decreases, the volume increases. During atrial systole, it occurs in 0.1 seconds. And what happens? The atrium is contracting minimally to push 10% of the blood into the ventricle, because gravity helps the atrium to push blood into the ventricle without the atrium contracting. Who is open? The same AV valve is open. The AV valve is open, the semilunar valve is closed, because you don't want immediately the blood is entering into the ventricle, it is going to the aorta. Now the atrial pressure increased slightly. And there's an increase in end diastolic volume inside the ventricle. The end diastolic volume inside the ventricle, but the atrial volume decreases. But the ventricular volume increases. Now during the ventricular diastole, they have the first rapid filling. What's the first rapid filling? The first rapid filling is when the 70% of the blood is entering into the ventricle. 70% of the blood is entering into the ventricle, and at this particular point, the AV pressure is increased. The atrial pressure increases more than the ventricular pressure, because the ventricular pressure is low because it's getting filled, while the atrial is high because it's the one pumping the blood. So at this particular point, the AV is open while the semilunar is closed. Now the pressure in the atrium increases while the pressure in the atrium increases while as it fills blood into the ventricle. I get it now, 70%. Now in slow filling, what happens? It's very slow. I get it, it's very slow. This is when blood is dripping down into the ventricle. Only 10% amount of the blood is pushed in at this particular point. The AV valve is still open, the semilunar valve is still closed. It occurs about 0.1 9 seconds. 0.9 seconds. You get it now. So the AV valve, the pressure is very low, while the volume increase slightly, slowly. Now the last one now, which is the last rapid filling, which coincides with the atrial systole. What happens here? The atria contracts strongly now, called the atrial kick, to push the last amount of blood into the what? Ventricle. The AV valve is still open, the semilunar valve is still closed. Okay, now the next one, when the total amount of blood is collected inside the ventricle, when the total amount of blood is collected inside the ventricle, what do we call it? We call it end diastolic volume. What happens? The ventricle contracts strongly and push out the blood. It contracts strongly and push out the blood. So when it contracts strongly and push out the blood, who is closed? The AV valve is closed, the semilunar valve is open. That's where we get our first heart sound. We get our first heart sound when the AV valve is closed and the semilunar valve is open. And when we are pumping, the amount of blood we are pumping is called the ejection fraction, which can be 60 to 67% or 55 to 65%. And the period whereby the ventricular pressure increases to push that blood out is called the ejection period. The ejection period is when the ventricular pressure increases to push out that blood. I get it. And the ventricular pressure has to be high in order to, because it produces an enormous contraction to push blood. If it doesn't produce an enormous contraction, which means the ventricle has a problem. I get him now. Immediately after the ventricle has pushed out blood, the total amount of blood that is remaining is called the what? The end systolic volume. The end systolic volume, which is about 70 to 80 ml or 55 to 65 ml. I get him now. Don't forget. So hope you understand everything I've talked about here. Hope you have understand. The most important fact here is that most of the ventricular filling, about 90%, occurs during diastole. And the AV valve prevents backflow. When the AV valve closes, it prevents backflow. It keeps the blood inside that chamber until they are released. The semilunar valve also prevents backflow of blood back to the aorta and the pulmonary artery. The coordination of this event ensures what? Efficiency of the heart. So hope you understand all these things I've said. Hope you understand this. So I hope this one makes sense to you and you have understood everything I've talked about in this video. Are you getting me now? If you understand, because I repeated most of the 10 times for you to understand. If you are new to my channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on your post notification button, so that anytime I drop any video, you'll be sure to be notified. If you want me to make a video for you, make sure you drop it down in the comment section. I promise I'll make that video for you here now. So I'll be moving to my next video, which is the heart sound. Keep it locked down every time, every day. Don't stop watching my video. Continue watching my video every time, every day. I'll see you in my next video on heart sound. Bye bye.